Carl Jung documented a psychological pattern so disturbing, it wasn't about empathy alone. It was about what happens when the empath finally chooses themselves, and why this moment of self-selection either leads to authentic individuation or reveals the psychological patterns that endless accommodation had been masking. In his work on individuation and psychological types, Jung documented what I call self-choice crisis, a pattern where highly sensitive individuals with dominant feeling functions would spend years prioritizing others' needs over their own authentic development, then face a critical moment when they must choose between continued self-abandonment or reclaiming their individual path. Jung called this pattern disturbing because these empathic individuals possessed what he described as overdeveloped auxiliary functions that served others while neglecting the self. When they finally chose themselves, their own needs, boundaries, and authentic expression, they didn't gradually adjust, but underwent what Jung termed individuation acceleration, revealing either their capacity for psychological wholeness or the depth of self-abandonment they'd been living. What made this discovery so significant to Jung was that this choice represented a crucial turning point in human psychological development, the moment when accommodation patterns either transform into conscious boundaries or collapse into recognition of how much authentic self had been sacrificed. Today, I'll reveal Jung's insights about what happens when the empath finally chooses themselves, and why he believed this decision either catalyzes genuine individuation or exposes the self-betrayal patterns that people-pleasing had been concealing all along. The patient who vanished into themselves. Jung's breakthrough came through observing a patient with extraordinary sensitivity who had spent decades accommodating others while ignoring their own psychological needs. After years of therapy exploring these patterns, the patient made what Jung called the choice, prioritizing their psychological well-being over others' comfort for the first time. Within weeks, Jung witnessed something unprecedented. The patient's helpful, accommodating persona began dissolving, revealing authentic personality aspects suppressed for decades. Jung documented this as psychological metamorphosis, like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon they'd mistaken for their natural form. The patient began expressing long-buried needs, setting boundaries, and pursuing abandoned interests. But this transformation triggered relationship system collapse. Family members responded with guilt trips and accusations of selfishness when their endless supply of accommodation suddenly ended. Jung realized this wasn't just personal change, but revelation of how many relationships depend on one person's willingness to abandon themselves. The patient's choice exposed the exploitative nature of connections they'd previously considered loving and supportive. What disturbed Jung most was the predictability. He could forecast exactly how different family members would react to losing their accommodating supply source, revealing the unconscious contracts that had governed these relationships. This case showed Jung that choosing oneself often means discovering which relationships were based on genuine care versus which required self-abandonment as the price of acceptance. The accommodation psychology. Jung discovered that empathic individuals develop what I call psychological imbalance syndrome, overdeveloping their feeling function to serve others while completely neglecting their authentic emotional needs and personal development. Jung identified three components of this system. External validation architecture. These individuals lose connection to their own values, preferences, and boundaries because their entire sense of worth becomes dependent on others' approval. Their psychological type becomes distorted, expertly reading others while remaining strangers to themselves. Shadow accumulation pressure. Jung documented that suppressed needs don't disappear, but accumulate as what he called shadow reserves. Their authentic desires, boundaries, and healthy selfishness become unconscious, creating internal pressure that manifests as depression, anxiety, or physical symptoms. Compensatory individuation trigger. When empaths finally choose themselves, Jung observed rapid rebalancing. The psyche attempts to restore equilibrium by bringing years of suppressed personality aspects into consciousness simultaneously. Jung realized this explains why choosing themselves feels so threatening. They've been conditioned to believe their worth depends on self-sacrifice, so prioritizing their own needs triggers deep abandonment fears and guilt about being selfish. When this system activates, empaths discover aspects of themselves they'd forgotten existed, often experiencing what Jung called personality archaeology, uncovering buried parts of their authentic nature. The guilt weapon that destroys them. Jung identified why choosing themselves is psychologically devastating for empaths. They experience what I call empathic guilt complex that can completely derail their individuation process. Jung observed 3 guilt patterns that emerge when empaths prioritize themselves. Betrayal guilt. They feel they're abandoning people who depend on them. Their newfound boundaries feel like cruelty, their self-care like selfishness, their authentic expression like harm to others. Identity guilt. Since their sense of self was built around accommodation, choosing themselves feels like becoming a completely different person, triggering fears of losing their essential nature. Worthiness, guilt. Years of conditioning taught them their value lies in usefulness to others, so self-prioritization feels like claiming something they haven't earned. Jung documented that this guilt complex often forces empaths back into self-abandonment patterns because the psychological discomfort feels unbearable. They mistake guilt for conscience and accommodation for love. Most disturbing to Jung was how others weaponize this guilt. When empaths begin setting boundaries, people who benefited from their accommodation often escalate guilt tactics using phrases like, "You've changed," or "You're becoming selfish," to manipulate them back into self-sacrifice. Jung emphasized that overcoming this guilt requires recognizing that self-abandonment isn't virtuous, but harmful, both to themselves and to people whose growth they prevent by enabling dependency. If you felt guilty for finally putting yourself first, comment, "My worth isn't measured by my usefulness." The 4 transformation pathways. Jung identified 4 distinct patterns empaths follow when choosing themselves, each representing different outcomes of this psychological transition. The gradual boundary builder. These empaths experience incremental awakening, slowly recognizing self-abandonment patterns and making small changes over time. Jung noted they maintain more relationships because changes feel less threatening, but also face persistent pressure from people hoping the phase will pass. The key breakthrough: they develop conscious accommodation, choosing when to help rather than automatically sacrificing themselves, creating healthier dynamics while maintaining their empathic nature. The crisis catalyst. Jung identified empaths who experience dramatic shifts, triggered by specific events, forcing them to choose between self-abandonment or psychological survival. They undergo persona collapse, sudden dissolution of their people-pleasing identity when accommodation becomes unsustainable. Crisis catalysts face more relationship upheaval, but achieve more complete transformation because the dramatic change makes returning to previous patterns impossible without conscious choice. The boundary specialist. These empaths focus on developing what Jung called psychological boundary mastery, distinguishing between their emotions and others, their needs and others' expectations, their values and others' projections. They become skilled at empathic discernment, maintaining sensitivity while protecting psychological integrity. They learn to feel others' emotions without absorbing them, offer support without self-sacrifice. The authentic integrator. Jung's most successful category represents empaths who develop genuine empathic strength, being fully themselves while maintaining deep emotional connections. They honor both their empathic nature and individual needs simultaneously. These empaths often report feeling more empathic than ever because they're no longer depleted by unconscious self-sacrifice. Their emotional availability becomes renewable because it's protected by wisdom rather than driven by compulsion. The dangerous transition risks. Jung identified specific psychological dangers that make choosing themselves one of the most challenging aspects of human development. Identity dissolution terror. Jung observed that empaths often experience ego structure collapse when they stop defining themselves through service to others. Since their entire identity was accommodation-based, choosing themselves triggers existential panic about who they are without familiar self-sacrificing. Roles. This crisis can be so severe that some return to self-abandonment rather than face the discomfort of psychological growth, convincing themselves they're naturally selfish when they prioritize their well-being. Social system earthquake. Jung documented relationship devastation patterns when empaths stop accommodating. People who relied on their endless availability respond with manipulation, guilt trips, or complete rejection, rather than adjusting to healthier dynamics. Jung noted that empaths often lose significant relationships during transition, not because they become cruel, but because many connections were based on exploitation rather than genuine care. Guilt overwhelm. Paralysis. The guilt complex becomes so intense it can disrupt psychological functioning entirely. Jung documented cases where empaths experienced moral injury, feeling they'd violated core values by setting boundaries. Without proper support, this guilt leads empaths back to self-abandonment or triggers psychological symptoms like severe anxiety and depression. Overcorrection extremes. Jung warned about empaths swinging from complete self-abandonment to defensive selfishness. Becoming so focused on protection, they lose their empathic nature entirely. This overcorrection often stems from unprocessed anger about exploitation. While natural and healthy, if anger becomes the driving force behind all decisions, empaths risk losing the sensitivity that was always part of their authentic nature. Jung's empathic individuation method. Jung developed systematic approaches for empaths to choose themselves while maintaining their empathic gifts and developing healthy relationship patterns. Shadow integration protocol. Jung insisted empaths must recognize disowned self-aspects, personality parts they'd suppressed, to maintain their accommodating persona. This includes healthy selfishness, legitimate anger, personal desires, and authentic boundaries. Jung created specific practices, documenting moments of self-suppression for others' comfort, identifying childhood conditioning that equated worth with usefulness, and practicing authentic expression in low-stakes situations to build confidence. Jung emphasized shadow integration doesn't mean becoming selfish, but recognizing that healthy self-care serves everyone's interests. Empaths who ignore their needs become depleted and resentful, reducing their capacity for genuine empathy. Conscious boundary architecture. Jung taught empaths to distinguish between empathy and absorption, helping and enabling, compassion and codependency, through what he called empathic discernment training. Specific protocols include learning to decline requests without extensive justification, recognizing guilt-based manipulation tactics, and developing filters that allow genuine connection while preventing psychological exploitation. Jung emphasized boundaries aren't walls, but selective membranes. They enhance empathy by preventing the depletion that leads to emotional shutdown. Authentic voice recovery. Jung recognized empaths need systematic practice, expressing genuine thoughts, feelings, and needs after years of suppression. This involves reconnecting with personal preferences, values, and desires that accommodation had silenced. Recommended practices include regular self-reflection to identify authentic feelings, creative expression as pathway to unconscious material, and gradually sharing genuine opinions in safe relationships to rebuild confidence. Relationship reconstruction standards. Jung emphasized building connections based on mutual respect and emotional reciprocity rather than one-sided accommodation. This requires relationship auditing, evaluating current connections for exploitation versus genuine care patterns. Jung developed criteria for healthy relationships: mutual emotional support, boundary respect, appreciation without expectation of endless availability, and encouragement of individual growth rather than demands for continued accommodation. Success and failure case studies. Jung's analysis reveals crucial patterns distinguishing successful empathic individuation from destructive overcorrection. Success model. Carl Rogers. Jung would have recognized Rogers as an empath who chose himself while enhancing his empathic gifts. Rogers developed professional empathy, feeling deeply for clients while maintaining therapeutic boundaries, protecting both parties. Rogers' breakthrough was understanding that unlimited emotional availability destroys helper and helped alike. He channeled empathic nature through structured, boundaried contexts, where sensitivity served healing rather than enabling dependency. Jung's analysis emphasizes Rogers never abandoned empathy, but learned to protect and direct it consciously, proving that choosing oneself can enhance rather than diminish genuine empathic capacity. Success model. Eleanor Roosevelt. Roosevelt's transformation from accommodating wife to independent leader demonstrates successful empathic individuation. She learned to channel sensitivity towards social justice rather than personal accommodation, finding outlets that honored empathy without requiring self-destruction. Roosevelt's evolution shows how empaths can redirect their gifts toward collective healing while maintaining personal boundaries, demonstrating that empathy and self-respect enhance each other. Failure pattern. The defensive shutdown. Jung documented empaths who swung from accommodation to complete emotional unavailability, developing empathy phobia, fear that any sensitivity leads back to exploitation. While this protects from further harm, it cuts them off from essential personality aspects. These individuals often report feeling empty because they rejected their empathic nature, along with harmful accommodation patterns. Failure pattern. The guilt recycler. Jung identified empaths who cycle between attempted boundary setting and accommodation when psychological discomfort overwhelms them. Each cycle reinforces their belief that self-prioritization equals selfishness. These patterns persist when empaths lack adequate support and mistake empathic guilt for moral conscience rather than recognizing it as conditioned fear. Critical success elements. Jung's analysis revealed successful transformation requires support systems during transition. Understanding empathy and boundaries can coexist, gradual practice rather than dramatic swings, and recognition that healthy relationships improve when both parties respect boundaries. Building empathy through protective communities. Jung recognized empaths need specific strategies to maintain healthy relationships while honoring their commitment to self-prioritization. Healthy relationship recognition. Jung identified characteristics indicating someone can handle individuated empaths. They appreciate empathy without exploiting it, maintain emotional self-regulation rather than depending on others for constant support, respect boundaries without taking them personally, and demonstrate reciprocal empathy, genuine concern for the empath's well-being. Healthy individuals encourage empathic boundary development rather than pressuring return to accommodation, seeing empathic self-care as positive growth rather than threatening withdrawal. Empathy-honoring communities. Jung recommended seeking relationships with people, understanding that empathy requires protection to remain sustainable. This includes others who've learned to balance sensitivity with boundaries, individuals engaged in conscious development who appreciate psychological growth, and secure people who don't require others' self-sacrifice to feel loved. Jung emphasized finding communities where sensitivity is valued but not exploited. Emotional intelligence is appreciated but not expected to be unlimited, and personal growth is encouraged rather than seen as relationship-threatening. Predator recognition, protocols. Jung warned about individuals specifically targeting empathic people for exploitation. Warning signs include sharing dramatic personal stories early to trigger rescue responses, consistently violating boundaries while claiming ignorance, reacting to empathic limits with guilt trips or anger, and demonstrating selective empathy, showing concern only when it serves their needs. Jung noted predators often use phrases like, "You're the only one who understands me," to create false specialness that hooks empathic individuals into exploitative dynamics. Relationship evolution strategies. Jung developed approaches for rebuilding connections after choosing self-prioritization, clear communication about changes being made, consistent boundary maintenance despite resistance, education about empathy versus enabling differences, and relationship graduation, evaluating whether connections can evolve to include mutual respect. The complete transformation journey. Jung documented predictable psychological changes when empaths choose themselves, representing authentic development rather than personality defects. Recognition shock phase. Empaths begin recognizing accommodation patterns and their psychological cost, often experiencing pattern shock, realizing how extensively they'd abandoned themselves. Jung noted healthy grief for the lost self, mourning authentic personality aspects suppressed for years. Boundary experimentation stage. Empaths practice small self-prioritization acts to build confidence, declining unreasonable requests, expressing genuine opinions, taking personal time without guilt. This stage often triggers strong reactions from people accustomed to unlimited availability. Authentic integration period. Jung identified when empaths learn honoring both empathic nature and individual needs simultaneously. They develop conscious empathy, choosing when to engage empathically rather than reacting automatically to others' emotional states. Empaths often report feeling more like themselves than ever because they're expressing previously suppressed personality aspects while maintaining natural sensitivity. Relationship revolution era. Individuated empaths attract different relationships, people appreciating authenticity rather than exploiting accommodation. Old connections either evolve to include mutual respect or naturally fade as dynamics change. Jung documented empaths becoming inadvertent teachers, showing through example that empathy and self-respect can coexist, that boundaries enhance rather than diminish genuine connection. Empathic mastery achievement. Jung's final stage represents empaths who've integrated sensitivity with healthy self-prioritization. They engage deeply without losing themselves, offer support without enabling dependency, maintain emotional availability without depletion. These empaths often find purpose helping others develop similar skills, transforming personal journeys into service, honoring both empathy and individuation. If you've discovered forgotten parts of yourself, comment, "I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be." Integration. Roadblocks and solutions. Jung identified specific dangers that derail empaths during transformation, warning about patterns preventing successful integration. The extreme swing trap. Jung warned about empaths moving from complete accommodation to defensive hardness, becoming so protection-focused they lose empathic gifts entirely. This stems from unprocessed anger about exploitation. Jung's solution involved graduated empathy, slowly reintroducing empathic engagement in safe contexts rather than swinging between absorption extremes and complete emotional shutdown. The guilt relapse cycle. Many empaths return to accommodation when self-prioritization guilt becomes overwhelming, creating cycles of attempted boundary setting, followed by guilt-driven self-sacrifice returns. Jung addressed this through guilt tolerance development, understanding that feeling guilty about self-care doesn't make self-care wrong, but indicates how deeply conditioned the empath was to prioritize others over themselves. The isolation overreaction. Jung warned about empaths withdrawing from all connection rather than learning boundaried relationships. While solitude aids self-discovery, complete isolation prevents developing healthy relationship skills. Jung recommended selective engagement, maintaining connections with emotionally healthy individuals while setting boundaries with exploitative people, rather than avoiding all relationships. The surface change deception. Jung identified empaths adopting boundary language without addressing underlying accommodation patterns. They set surface limits while continuing to prioritize others' emotional comfort over authentic expression. Jung emphasized authentic transformation includes internal changes in self-relationship, not just external management of others' demands. The cultural impact. Jung believed empaths choosing themselves serves crucial functions in collective psychological development, modeling healthier relationship dynamics and challenging cultural exploitation of sensitivity. Jung observed empathic individuals often carry collective emotional labor, absorbing psychological material others refuse to face. When empaths stop this function, it forces communities toward emotional maturity. Relationship evolution modeling, individuated. Empaths demonstrate that sensitivity and strength coexist, challenging beliefs that empathy requires self-sacrifice. Their example gives others permission to honor empathic nature while maintaining boundaries. Communities with individuated empaths develop higher emotional intelligence standards because empaths no longer enable others' emotional immaturity through endless accommodation. Social system transformation. When empaths choose themselves, they force evolution in their social systems. Exploitative relationships naturally end, while genuine connections adapt to include respect for empathic needs. This process, though initially disruptive, creates healthier dynamics throughout the empath's network. As others learn, love doesn't require one person's self-abandonment. Consciousness evolution contribution. Jung believed empaths learning to balance sensitivity with self-respect contribute to collective individuation. Humanity's development toward conscious, authentic relationship patterns. Individuated empaths become pioneers, demonstrating that emotional depth and personal boundaries enhance rather than threaten genuine connection, modeling evolved human relationship possibilities. The return to wholeness. What happens when the empath finally chooses themselves is a return to psychological completeness. Jung's research reveals this choice transforms empathy from unconscious absorption into conscious compassion, from compulsive accommodation into authentic care. When empaths prioritize their psychological needs, they discover sensitivity was never the problem. The problem was boundary absence that allowed their gift to be exploited rather than honored. Jung's insights show empathy without self-respect becomes enabling, while empathy with healthy boundaries becomes healing. The transformation isn't about becoming selfish, but becoming whole. Empaths who choose themselves don't lose connection capacity. They gain ability to connect authentically rather than through savior-victim dynamics. Your empathic nature isn't a burden requiring management, but a gift deserving protection. Jung's work demonstrates sensitivity, combined with self-respect, creates possibilities for relationships based on mutual empathy. rather than one-sided sacrifice. Choosing yourself isn't betrayal of your empathic nature. It's integration that allows empathy to serve healing rather than enabling, growth rather than stagnation, authentic love rather than codependent attachment. Jung concluded that individuated empaths become possibility beacons, showing the world that deep feeling and strong boundaries can coexist, that empathy and self-care enhance each other, and that choosing yourself is often the most empathic choice possible. If you've finally chosen yourself after years of choosing everyone else, comment, "I honor my empathy by protecting it." Your transformation from unconscious accommodation to conscious compassion represents exactly what Jung meant by individuation, becoming who you were always meant to be. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.